Hello everyone and welcome back to a brand new video from me, Pickles Parker Reviews. Now today I'm reviewing the Doctor Who Big Finish story, The Juggernauts, starring Colin Baker as the 6th Doctor, Bonnie Langford as his companion Mel, and Terry Malloy as Davros. Now last week I reviewed the story Davros, and I mentioned that it was a story that I was supposed to review in 2019. I listened to it, recorded the review, but it never went out. And a similar thing happened with the review of the Juggernauts, and I decided to once again listen to these stories back to back, because obviously I did that with those reviews. And the reason I did that with those original reviews was because I got both of these stories in a sale for Christmas 2018, I want to say. This is how long I have taken to review these stories. It just shows what a ridiculous amount of back catalogue I have in terms of Big Finish. Yeah, so I got these two in a sale. I think they were both reduced, which is why I bought these two audios, I think, along with Weird the Daleks and Order of the Daleks. And ultimately, these stories are quite similar. I think especially after listening to them back to back, you really notice how similar they are, because it's not just a 6th Doctor and Davros story. It explores similar themes, and I think that ultimately one is very clearly better than the other, but I don't think that necessarily means that this story isn't good, because it certainly is. It certainly has its good moments. However, having listened to Davros like just the other week and reviewing these back to back, expect some comparisons to the story Davros in this video, because they are so similar that I just can't not compare them really. That would just be a virtually impossible task. So there will be some comparisons here, and while one is better than the other, that doesn't mean that this isn't good, because I still did enjoy the Juggernauts. Now the basic premise for this story is that essentially there's a ship sending out an SOS, the Doctor and Mel get on it and it's crashing. Essentially the Doctor sends Mel into an escape pod for her safety because the ship is going to explode. He goes off in the TARDIS and they get separated. Mel lands in Lethe, on the planet Lethe, where she gets involved with this tech company with a scientist and a few colleagues, where they're making these house robots called Juggernauts that can do anything supposedly, and they're looking for investment to sell them across the galaxy. Meanwhile, the Doctor's been taken out of his TARDIS via time corridor with an offer from the Daleks. It's revealed that the professor that Mel is working under, who's made these Juggernauts, who seemingly seems like the nicest professor ever, is actually Davros, under a disguise which nobody can see through. Ultimately, the Daleks say that the Doctor needs to go and stop Davros, and in return they'll keep Mel alive essentially, and that he needs to stop Davros from doing whatever he's doing and hand him over to the Daleks, and then him and Mel will be let free. And the Doctor doesn't really have any choice in this, so he goes down, and obviously then he reveals to everyone that it's Davros, and Davros meanwhile reveals his plan that the Juggernauts are actually Mechanoids. Well, they're not Mechanoids as such. Well, they are Mechanoids, but they're not in disguise as Mechanoids. They are the original Mechanoids. This is where the Mechanoids come from, which I thought was pretty interesting. It's a Mechanoid origin story, essentially. And essentially, these house robots serve an extra purpose. They're also extremely efficient Dalek killers, and that they will go around, kill all the Daleks, and then go back to serving their function as house robots, and that's how he's going to distribute them across the world, by having them as house robots. And that ultimately they're not just machines, they are part human. He has gone in, discombobulated humans that were present on Lethe, part of the security staff, and made them into proto-mechanoids, essentially. And he's got two Daleks working with him that survived the ship that took him from Necros at the end of Revelation of the Daleks, and obviously now the Daleks want him back. And these two Imperial Daleks survived, so they're kind of helping him out, although they're severely damaged. Once the Doctor gives the Daleks assign, they come down, and there's an all-out war between the Mechanoids, or the Juggernauts, shall I say, and the Daleks, which results in a few casualties, and then ultimately the Daleks revealed that it was 2 birds, 1 stone, and now they've got not only Davros under their control, but also the Doctor, and that they double-cross the Doctor, and that they're going to kill all of them. Obviously, that doesn't happen, but that's the general story. And yeah, it's pretty interesting. I think you can really see that this is when Big Finish was starting to become quite fan-servicey. This story not only serves as a continuation of Revelation of the Daleks and a kind of gap filler between Revelation and Remembrance of the Daleks, but it also serves as an origin story for the Mechanoids. And yeah, you can really see that perhaps this was just written as a bit of a gap filler to fulfill certain areas of Doctor Who that have been left unanswered. But I think that it does do that effectively in telling an interesting story. I think the actual story, Davros going undercover, pretending to be nice, oh whoops, he isn't, he's actually doing something under our noses, creating something evil, and an evil experiment, and the Doctor has to stop him. That's ultimately a story we've seen quite a few times. It's literally the plotline used in Revelation of the Daleks. Now, that part isn't very original, but I think what is original, however, is how it plays out that story. I think having it an origin story for the Mechanoids certainly helped make this unoriginal plot thread sound pretty original. It makes it interesting by having the Mechanoids in there. However, I think what is the most interesting facet of this story is Mel. Now, I spoke about in my We Are the Daleks review how interesting I found Mel in that story. She was a completely different character to what we got in the TV show, heavily improved. Bonnie Langford had such confidence in this role, and Mel had such confidence and was just great in this part. She felt like an independent character who was headstrong, could deal with herself in situations, and was just a very well-rounded character. And she wasn't even really the focus in We're the Daleks. However, something that this story has is that Mel isn't it more than a Doctor. In a sense, it's a bit of a Doctor-like story, particularly early on, because obviously Mel gets ejected into that escape pod, and after that we follow the story through her eyes. We only meet up back with the Doctor at the end of part 1, where it's the cliffhanger that the Professor is Davros. So ultimately we explore Mel throughout the first part as we see her in this new world, this colony of Lethe. And ultimately, this is where comparisons start to set in, because Lethe was a bit similar to the colony in Davros, particularly in terms of the technology. It was obviously very futuristic. In Davros, you had the rooms where you've got the AI planning everything out. And in this, you have another AI which you can tell to dim the lights, put something weird on the windows, you know, some visual images, that kind of thing, which is obviously very similar. You get a similar colony-esque atmosphere. You can almost picture the dome that you have in Davros being very similar to the colony that you get in Lethe. And as I said, that's probably an unfortunate coincidence of listening to these stories back to back, but it is what it is. But anyway, Mel is fitting in quite well in this colony. She's doing extremely well. She's got in with this tech company making all this stuff, getting in on these inventions, this big project with the Professor, and she's made friends with 2 of her colleagues, Sonali and Jeff in particular, who she's actually really good friends with. And ultimately, I just find it really interesting to see Mel in this sort of position. We've never really seen Mel away from the Doctor, especially for a substantial period of time. It's said that Mel has been there for 3 months, so it's really interesting to see Mel in a new environment and having settled in, living a normal life in this colony, especially as she is from the 80s. It's pretty interesting to see her adjust and for her to work on these projects. And yeah, I just thought it was really interesting to see Mel developed and explored in this way. I really like her relationships with Sonali and Jeff, particularly Jeff. They have a great friendship, and it's really nice to see that developed. And ultimately, you know, it's nice to see that relationship developed, and these side characters, you do care for them, especially when they get picked off. I think both Sonali and Jeff are really well performed, and they're really good characters. You really do care for them, especially Jeff, who you kind of feel a bit sorry for. Mel's kind of giving him the cold shoulder, but she does share the feelings that Jeff clearly has for her. There is a touching scene where she never gets to really share that love with Jeff, because he ultimately sacrifices himself to let the rest of the colony go and leave Lethe to escape the Dalek and Mechanoid war, and he sacrifices himself for that, and that's quite sad. You do care about these characters. I did care when Jeff died, and yeah, that's sad. That is just great world building there, to really care about these characters, and it's all linked to their relationships with Mel, and yeah, it's just very strange to have Mel, a character who really wasn't explored in the TV series, to be explored in a lot of detail in this story. It was pretty strange, but it's really welcome. As I said, I liked Bonnie Langford as Mel in We Are the Daleks. I found her really enjoyable, and I love the new facets of her character that they explored in that story. But this just dials up to 11. Mel is essentially the main character for a lot of this story. You follow her, and she's really interesting. I also like how Mel actually tries to kill Davros in this story, which is really interesting. Obviously, the Doctor has a no-gun policy. He's a pacifist, naturally. But when Mel has the opportunity to kill Davros, after all, she thought he was a nice professor. He tricked her, and ultimately his plan got a lot of her friends killed, people she thought Davros cared about, but ultimately he really didn't care about them at all. And it's really interesting to see Mel have that emotional struggle and ultimately try and kill Davros. Ultimately it doesn't work, but it's really interesting to see her essentially have that power in her hands and say, yeah, I am going to kill Davros. That was really interesting. And then there's a chat at the end of the Doctor trying to reassure Mel that what she did doesn't make her a monster, which was a really nice Doctor and companion moment there. A really nice Colin Baker and Mel moments there. So yeah, Mel is really nicely explored. She adds a lot of the world building. We see the world through her eyes. It's all pretty new to us, and we see her explore it. So through the world, it's all explored through her eyes. All the characters we need to explore through her eyes. And yeah, it's a great exploration of Mel. And yeah, she's really good in the story. And as I mentioned before, I'm really enjoying seeing more of Bonnie Langford on Big Finish. I think she's great. I really like what they've done with the companion and the character of Mel. And yeah, I can't wait to listen to more stories with Bonnie Langford, because she was really good in this. And a great chemistry with Colin Baker's Doctor. In We Are the Daleks, she had great chemistry with Sylvester's Doctor. And she has great chemistry with Colin Baker's Doctor in this story. Speaking of Colin Baker's Doctor, he's really great in this as well. I think that the Doctor doesn't really have as many good moments as he does in a story like Davros, where Colin Baker could really flex his acting chops. Ultimately in this, he is sidelined for the earlier parts of the story, as I mentioned before, where Mel takes up the bulk of the main character role. However, I once again like that you have the Doctor going in, trying to convince people that Davros is bad. You actually have a conversation between the Doctor and Mel, and Mel doesn't believe him. She simply doesn't believe the Professor is Davros. Ultimately, the Doctor's right. That's a pretty interesting scene. I mentioned the comforting scene between the Doctor and Mel at the end of the story, where he tries to reassure her. And yeah, Colin Baker's great. As I said, not too many standout moments in this, but Colin Baker's just great. I've mentioned it before, but I really like Colin Baker on Big Finish. They've superbly written his Doctor, and Colin Baker acts it amazingly as well. His Doctor's so entertaining, and he's great in this story as well. I think his Doctor just suits Terry Malloy's Davros so well. As I mentioned in the Davros review, ultimately they only shared one story together, which was Revelation of the Daleks. So it's pretty interesting that they feel like they're really suited to each other, even though they only shared one story. But no, Colin Baker works really well in this story. And Davros, Terry Malloy. Davros is interesting in this story. Obviously, he's not explored as in depth as he is in something like Davros, but it is a good Davros story nonetheless. It maintains what I really like about Davros, his manipulative nature. There's a character called Kreyn who is not in command of the companies trying to buy the Juggernauts, but ultimately Davros manipulates him through his alcoholism and ultimately kills all the members of the companies that may not accept his offer in full to produce the Juggernauts, and then he essentially manipulates Kreyn into doing what he wants. It's a really great scene. You really see the power of Davros, and what I love about Davros is that he's wheelchair bound, he's crippled, he has no physical power, yet you always feel like he's in control in every situation, and that's to do with his mind, and Terry Malloy acts that brilliantly. And that's one of the things I love about Davros, and this story gets it down to a T. I really like the idea of Davros redeveloping this vendetta against the Daleks. In the story that supposedly precedes this, which is obviously Revelation of the Daleks, he's obviously creating new Daleks at tranquil repose, Daleks that are loyal to him. However, in this, he doesn't just want to create Daleks that are loyal to him, he just wants to wipe out the Daleks altogether. He even says that he's kind of done with universal domination, he just wants the Daleks gone, which is pretty interesting. But he doesn't care what bloodshed leads to him meeting those ends. Obviously, he's literally killed humans and literally discombobulated their remains and made them into full functioning robots. That is pretty dark. And you've got a horrifying scene where the Doctor and Mel look inside a Juggernaut casing and talk about the stench and it's awful. It's a really horrifying scene actually. So that's pretty interesting. So Davros, he's not explored as in depth here, but ultimately I think that he still has some great moments. As I said, the manipulative nature. He has some great moments with the Doctor. He seems like he actually has some compassion. At a few points, he says to the Daleks, "Don't kill Mel," which I thought was pretty interesting. There's a nice scene at the end as well, where after he survives Mel trying to kill him, he essentially says, "Don't worry, Mel. You know, I understand," which is a really weird moment. Actually, weird in a good way. It's a really kind of, yeah, that's kind of strange, but it makes sense for Davros to say that. I think that ultimately the story isn't the most original. As I mentioned earlier on in this review, we have seen Davros go undercover and fool people into letting him experiment on things before. However, it is given a new facet here. I think as well this story had a few similar beats to the Batman March animated story Salvage Mission, I want to say it's called, which is essentially set in between, it's also set in between Revelation and Remembrance of the Daleks, where Davros, he escapes the ship and he's brought on. And there's a few similarities there. It's also similar to the Batman March story, The Oncoming Storm, if not more so, where you've got Davros working at a company and he essentially fools them all. And again, that was a similar story to Davros, although he wasn't fooling them. But again, this isn't exactly an original story template. It's getting very similar vibes off of previous Big Finish stories, Batman Marches, figure animations. Obviously, Revelation of the Daleks, the first to actually do this. It's not the most original story, but I think there are some nice moments with Mel, with the Doctor, with Davros. I think that there are certainly some interesting ideas there with the origins of the Mechanoids, the horrifying stuff that's in the Mechanoids, which I thought is really nice. I haven't seen the chase. I mentioned this in my review of the Daleks animated series episode where the Mechanoids returned, that I actually hadn't seen the chase. But I'm really interested to watch it because it was really interesting to see them explore the origin of the Mechanoids. I think it was really interesting seeing Davros make them, and now you can see why they're perfect Dalek killers. It's really quite cool. And yeah, I thought the origin story for the Mechanoids was pretty interesting and pretty horrifying when you reveal their humanoid remains. The Daleks as well, this will probably be the last thing I'll talk about, I suppose. The Daleks don't really have too much to do in this story. Even though they're on the front cover, it is very much a Doctor and Davros story, similar to Davros. Obviously in Davros no Daleks turn up, but in this, the Daleks, they do appear at the end of part 1, but then they don't appear again until much later on when they have the war with the Mechanoids. They have some sinister moments. It's cool to see their war with the Mechanoids. It's cool to see the 2 damaged Daleks, the 2 damaged Imperial Daleks made on Necros, who aren't really functioning properly. But yeah, the Daleks, they don't have a massive role in this, but they're still pretty cool. So overall, what did I think of the Juggernauts? Ultimately, it's a pretty interesting story. It's probably the weakest story I've reviewed so far. That's out of Weird the Daleks, Davros, and obviously the Juggernauts, mainly because its story was ultimately pretty unoriginal. The idea of seeing Davros disguise himself as a good person, as a good scientist, and experiment on something evil under good pretenses, we've seen that so many times before this, and obviously after this. Ultimately, parts of this story do feel pretty unoriginal. It's a pretty unoriginal idea. However, I think the plot specifics really bring this story up. I really like the Mel in this story. I really like how it explores her. We see her in a new setting, and we see her essentially carry most of this story, especially the early parts. We see the world explore through her. It's great world building in this story, and the side characters are great as well. I like their relationships with Mel, and you really care for Sonali and Jeff, and especially when Jeff dies, you do care, which not all stories achieve, so I think that's a great feat for this story. I think that Davros was pretty well integrated into this story, and he had some nice moments, especially with his manipulative nature, and obviously his weird moral compass. I think it's interesting setting between Revelation and Remembrance, and it does some interesting things there, particularly with a Dalek Civil War. You get little hints of that, which obviously you got in Revelation, explored more here, and obviously exploring the origin of the Mechanoids and the horrifying origins behind them. It's really cool as well. Obviously it's not the most groundbreaking story, it's not the most original, but I do think there are some interesting aspects explored in this story, some interesting delves into certain characters such as Mel, who obviously wasn't explored that much in the TV show, and ultimately, while it may not be as good as Davros, I still think it was a really good 6th Doctor and Davros story, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's not the most original, but I'd still listen to it, because it's certainly an interesting one, and I certainly enjoyed it nonetheless. But thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, drop a sub, and hit that notification bell to stay notified for all my latest videos. Did you enjoy this Big Finish review? What did you think of the Juggernauts? Whatever you think, drop your thoughts in the comment section below. I'd be really interested to read them. And in terms of what Big Finish story I'm reviewing next week, it's another 6th Doctor Dalek story. It's actually the final one of this kind of loose trade I've been reviewing. I've obviously reviewed Davros, the Juggernauts, and now I'm going to be reviewing Order of the Daleks, starring the 6th Doctor and new companion Constance Clark, to see the Daleks in a very odd location, a new take on the Daleks, something certainly sinister is going on, and this looks to be very original. It looks to be really interesting, a really unique story, and I can't wait to listen to it. So join me next week when I review Order of the Daleks. But yes, thank you guys for watching, and of course, a goodbye.